it's interesting that the apostles remember when Jesus is cleansing the temple. I'm sure they had to be shocked about what was happening, the scripture tells us that they remembered that there was this prophecy that zeal for God's house would consume him. And one of the things that we see is that what Jesus is doing can go all the way back to the Old Testament, to the book of Zechariah in chapter 14, verses 20 and 21. So if you wouldn't mind reading that, we can talk about how that fits in.
Yeah. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them, and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day.
So when it talks about there no longer being a traitor in the house of the Lord on that day, that's not traitor, but trader, somebody who's trading. Why is that a bad thing? And why is Zechariah here prophesying a time when that won't be happening?
I think maybe we alluded to that in the last part of the last lesson, and just, all of a sudden, God being the focus and God being the highest, elevated to the highest thing at the temple, whereas all of a sudden now maybe personal profit in some way, shape, or form gets elevated above that. I think that's kind of the issue.
It's interesting that the Hebrew word for trader there is Canaanite. So given that connection, is there anything bigger going on here than just the mere, let's get these guys out. Let's move them a little past the outside courts. And, they're a little too close to the temple. We just need to move them a little farther out. I mean, really what's going on here?
So it's interesting, and it reminds me of, I think, with Nehemiah and the honoring of the Sabbath, and how he kicks out the foreign traders, the Canaanite traders, if you will, and stuff like this, and locks the gates of the city and says, "Don't come back. And if you come back on a Sabbath, there's going to be a price to pay," and things of this sort. And so maybe in the same light, here, it's obviously not the Sabbath, but the temple itself, and kind of traders have no place in this portion, as the Canaanites didn't either. Kind of an interesting, the analogy there.
Some theologians will talk about in the book of Revelation that the idea of buying and selling is really pointed to worship. Now, what is the relationship between buying and selling and worship, and how might that play into both the sin of the Canaanites in general and the sin that's going on here in the temple?
Maybe it might be lost on us a little bit. If you go to a store, oftentimes a normal corporate store, the price is the price, and either you buy it or not. But it's still there as well. But I think maybe we'd see this a little more on a place where it's kind of more of a mom and pop store, and you're going to barter over the price and haggle over the price, and at the end of the day, you're ascribing value to whatever you purchase. You're ascribing the worth of it, and in that sense, maybe that's the title worship.
So we have a situation here where God is to be worshipped at the temple, and God is to be ascribed all glory, all honor, all worth, all value. And there's a sense in which every day when we go out to buy and sell things, we're ascribing some value to something. Given that, what's the problem here with the traders, and how does that relate to Canaanites in general, and the idea that Israel comes and replaces the Canaanites, but is kind of in the same position here as the Canaanites?
Yeah, it's one of those things. If this one place, and you could say about the Sabbath as well, the one day, and it's supposed to be a day where God has the highest value, and if all of a sudden either that place or that day even, but that place in this case, is associated with putting value on something else, I don't know how that could not help but diminish God's value, and especially if the Jews who are guilty in this case start viewing the temple as a place for their personal profit and not a place where they honor God and ascribe Him value, there's a great danger there, and obviously there is they're being likened to the people they replaced in the Promised Land.
There's a sense in which what's happening here is that this is a microcosm of just what's going on in Israel proper. That when you look at the religious leaders and you look at Jesus problems with the religious leaders, the seven woes and things like that that will come later on in Jesus' ministry as he has conflict with the religious leaders. There's a tie-in here between these traders in the temple and the religious leaders. The religious leaders are using the law to aggrandize themselves, and they're basically robbing the people in doing that. And there's a sense in which I think that what the religious leaders are doing is they're diverting the people's elevation and declaring the worth of God. They're diverting some of that to themselves. Would you agree with that?
I would. And obviously, in the case of the traders, and oftentimes these traders were either the leaders or working within the good graces of the leaders. Definitely you hear, that people made great treks to Jerusalem and to the temple to make sacrifices, and they couldn't take animals with them, or sometimes they could, but it was never good enough, and these traders would exchange it for one that was good enough, but then go ahead and do the same thing with the animal they just got, and definitely kind of pillage the people and maybe take a little bit of what was due God in that case for themselves.
Yeah, if you look at the seven woes, how do those tie into really what Jesus is doing here? What's his accusation against the religious leader if we break those down?
I don't recall all seven woes off the top of my head, but part of them is like, you tithe mint and cumin and dill and things of this sort, and yet the weightier matters of the law you kind of ignore entirely. Justice and mercy and things of this sort is one of them. And kind of outwardly maybe they honor God, but inwardly it's corruption to the core.
Right. And one of the things that they are accused of is going over land and sea to win a convert and making him twice the son of hell, and tying up heavy loads on men's backs, and they're not willing to lift it. What if we look at what the Pharisees and Sadducees are doing? They're using the law to glorify themselves instead of glorifying God. And by doing that, they're putting a huge obstacle or tying a huge burden on the backs of the people. How does that work exactly? What's the burden that they're putting on the people?
The burden in that specific case, I think, is this legalistic interpretation of the relationship to God. And it's about every little tiny thing that you do, and not the nature of why you do everything that you do. And the focus becomes very man-centered and not very God-centered at all. And it really devolves down into a list of rules to follow instead of a relationship with the creator of the universe.
Right. It seems like Jesus is drawing a contrast in his criticism of them, saying that they tie up heavy loads, putting burdens on the backs of these people. And his statement that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And there seems to be an element where, because they're using the law to make themselves look good, they have to make a relationship with God as difficult as possible, and then turn around to people and say, see, I can do it and you can't. Obviously, that is opposed to what Jesus is doing. What is it that Jesus is really coming here to do? What's the difference between what Jesus wants to do and what the religious leaders are doing?
Jesus is providing access to this relationship with God that's open to anyone and everyone, and he's the door through which anyone can walk to have that relationship. It's not for the spiritual elite. It is for anyone willing to have faith.
Yeah, there's a sense in which Jesus is taking the burden for people in their relationship to God, and the religious leaders are increasing the burden in their relationship to God. And so there couldn't be a greater contrast between what Jesus is there to do in his ministry and what the religious leaders are currently doing.